one of the things that I still think is important is because I also get kind of allergic to what we use, how we use the word communities. And I became very, very allergic to that word when a good friend of mine called me that I was the source communities for slavery. And I didn't know what to do with that because I never felt that I was a source community for slavery or the slavery past. So that was a part of my allergy. But similarly, as Amal and I speak quite often, and I don't want to name Amal from the back there, but as we speak very often in terms of the politics of community practice in the Netherlands, one of the interesting things that we often come up on is how particular narratives of blackness excludes particular black people because they do not fall within the framework of how one constitutes blackness within the Dutch context. And so how might we think these community practices in terms of other forms of solidarity is something that I'm interested in. And what does it mean to think that solidarity pushes us to think community, but think how we move beyond community in any close sense. That a community, no matter what, is going to be so messy. And it is how do we deal with the messiness of that to make it work. As they come, please come. One thing I would like you to encourage, you all here to help me encourage everybody who's presented here this over these 2 days to commit to a publication that we're proposing to do a publication out of this conference, which is going to pull these different ideas together. And the idea for this publication will be a series that we're trying to create, which actually opens up new starting points, new ways of thinking for ethnographic and world cultures museum. For example, the first in the series that we are proposing is a conference we had last year called Museum Temporalities, and how time works within museums in different ways. But one of the titles that we're interested in, actually, Barbara, is to think of questions of how to think co-contemporaneity by thinking how ethnographic museums have been addressing the contemporary in multiple ways, and not only, I would even say, beyond contemporary art, because we've moved past that fetishization of contemporary art, I think, but beyond contemporary art and thinking in the contemporary. Okay, 3 presenters, 5 minutes, yeah? Point perspectives, and then we go into a discussion again. Who will start?
Maybe I can start before I fall from the chair.
Yeah,
I have
yeah.
this feeling.
You feel like you're going to fall?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh.
Is it on? Yeah.
Yes, it's on.
Okay, yes, I'll try to be quick. I just wanted to sort of lay myself on the table as a case study. I think this is what I can do, my experience as a case study, but also me as a person, as I've been appointed curator for Africa at the Linden-Museum in January, and I'm Italian, and I have opened a communication collaboration with Germans. That's the Africans in Germany. You know, I am the stranger, so I'll try to bring it, make it more clear in 5 minutes what's going on. But, I think the choice that Ines de Castro and her colleagues made to choose me as a curator from Italy who doesn't know German in Stuttgart makes everything a bit different in my case. As
something wrong now.
Sorry? Yeah, I'll talk. Okay, the chair is already scary enough, Okay. Basically, very quickly, Wayne asked us this morning if we had an idea of what we had been also accomplishing with RIME and SWICH. Just one, not so simple maybe thing is that the Ines de Castro's idea to support my collaboration with representatives of the African diaspora in Stuttgart comes from Tervuren, from the Comraf. So I guess, we're here in the company of Ruth Phillips, and that's not a coincidence. I mean, we've been inspired, and we apparently keep believing that one way or another we have to talk and we have to bring people into the museum and, open flows from outside and inside and back. Yeah, but what makes my experience very peculiar really is that they are teaching me what it means to be German. I mean, they're more German than I am. And one of the things that I've been learning as a migrant in Stuttgart who doesn't speak German is that the language is very important as a feature of identity for Stuttgarters or for Schwäbisch people in Stuttgart, which is an internal ethnic minority who has, the symbolic belonging to Baden-Württemberg. And they know all these things much better than me. And we have these meetings that are very interesting because they help me. They give me sort of like guidelines to the German language, and they try to help me, become a good German. And in the process, I am also going to the Volkshochschule in the evening, where I take lessons, and these lessons are I share them with migrants of all different backgrounds, from refugees to U.S. military members. And in the process of learning German, we're also learning what it means to be a good German. You know how it works. They make you examples that are very socializing example, and they, for example, to be punctual is very important for a good German. Blah 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 blah. So I really don't feel like I am the German curator in the big rich town, allowing some minority to come in. I am part of the process, and I am part of a process that's changing citizenship, possibly in Stuttgart. There is a lot of us in the Volkshochschule, and that's scary. There is a lot of possible future citizens that are, entering one of the last places in Europe that seems to be seriously wanting to try to welcome them, in their own terms, and the language is the first thing that you have to do. But then you also you feel this pressure to be socialized. But I'm closing, the other part of the problem is that, we make all our efforts to become good Germans and to appear, German. And then a couple of incidents, though, convinced me that something else is being asked to people like me in Stuttgart today, to people like me or the members of my board of advisors for the Africa collection. And that was an artist who has an association. She came to visit the museum. I tried to have all the vital elements of society that are interested in the museum to give me feedback and try to establish collaboration with them. And she and her had just met. We were in the current Africa exhibition, and we were talking about, cultural diversity and what I was going to do and how difficult it was to, make a new permanent exhibition about Africa in 2016. And I was talking to her about, migrants and how they were trying to adapt, and she lowered her voice and she said, sometimes I think they're integrated too much. I was like, what do you mean? And I was afraid that she was, xenophobic, like we don't want them. No, she was saying they become too German. And that's not the only time I heard this. I heard sort of like a question for novelty and something else to come into the cultural identity of Stuttgart, and Stuttgart is the interesting city. It's a city where people come for work mostly. A city where a very strange identity and somewhat cold in a way. I don't know if it's a wrong thing I'm saying, but I have met very, very, very few people, even Germans, that come from Berlin and come to live in Stuttgart and are happy about it, Everybody wants to go to live in London, New York, blah, blah. Stuttgart, no. So I think, but I think there is we shared, the problem of citizenship, and also, a need to sort of refresh also human relations in a Europe that's become too strict and too cold for itself. Maybe, it's probably a reference to what Amsel has said, La Friche, we need, new stuff. But also the problem is the problem. The thing is that we are changing. I mean, me and my colleagues from the Volkshochschule are probably going to be new Stuttgarters. And so, this is the issue of citizenship entering the museum. And I'm hoping, that in the new permanent exhibition at the Linden-Museum, these issues come in as questions, as, you know, it's been coming out, you know, displaced objects and people like me and other people that don't belong to a physical space, maybe in the museum have a strange space of temporary or creative belonging in which we could try and devise, you know, a new kind of foundation for a sort of citizenship that's already changed a lot. Yeah, more or less.
Yeah, okay, thank you. She didn't say anything wrong, Ines. Okay, good.
Just kidding, please.
I'm just kidding as well. Go ahead, Nadja.
Yeah, thank you. I think what you were referring to is very interesting because it's this continuum that, or this, no, when you, this spectrum between acknowledging difference but being too different to belong anywhere. So where do you place yourself, and where do you place your exhibitions, your work, your objects within that frame, so that a vast majority might still be able to understand what you are saying and get your point across. What I've learned from this conference, and what I've been interested in the past also, is that and especially the last two talks referred to very strongly, is that our politics and our policy makers strongly influence what we are doing, but we're not always quite so ready to acknowledge that as well. Mm-hmm. And that we have to work in that frame, and it is sometimes, I think sometimes it still refers to that notion of museums as the temple or the church of art, and going there and not being, everything has an order, a specific order that was dedicated to it, that someone thought of, and not, you can, I think it came up at some point, that you can escape the real world for a little bit.
Yeah.
And while that is a very valid claim, again, on a spectrum, it shouldn't, I don't think it should be reduced to that. Yeah, and maybe this is because I am only starting out and haven't faced any very much frustration within my work. But I would like to argue that our museums are contested areas. I think it's safe to establish that. But they can also be spaces of belonging for a very diverse group of people, and that maybe we could try and experiment and establish laboratories, not in the natural history sense, but rather in the experiment, maybe art sense, although that has its fault as well. How we express these articulations of diversity. And I think museums in Euro-America have a very, have a global sort of language, but their articulation is very local. So, yeah, I think I will maybe leave it at that.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, let me continue. I somehow feel exotic in the company of these big European museums, because I'm coming from the Slovene Etnografski Museum from Ljubljana, Slovenia. And you can imagine that we are dealing very, very much with Slovene national identity, because the Slovene nation is only 2 million nation, and it is living within independent state till 1991, and the 83% of Slovene inhabitants are Slovenes. So you can imagine that after establishing new museum, ethnological museum, at the end of the 90s. It was our first task, really, to present collections of the ways of life of Slovene people. But on the other side, also so-called non-European collections that were brought to Slovenia by travelers, by missioners, and so on. And still, we are a lot to say about Slovenes, because the wounded from the Second World War haven't been healed yet. We still have strong discussions between those who are the winners and those who are not the winners. And so this is one point, that we are still thinking very much about our citizenship, our belonging. And on the other side, we are opening more and more global questions. And this is also the task of our museum. And for example, I will just shortly tell you what we are doing at the present. Maybe you've read in the newspapers that a lot of migrants were passing Slovenia, and that there were very difficult situations on the border between Slovenia and Croatia. And so our colleagues from the museum went there, helping refugees, and also making field work, collecting wire from the border, tents, and other material things of the refugees. This is one thing. And on the other side, we are preparing an exhibition of encounters between Slovenes and Afghani, which were very, very vivid exactly in the 70s and 80s of the 19th century. And of course, SWICH project that gives us a very, very nice opportunity to establish a closer relationship between members of African, I can say, community. Of course, this is not the, as we've heard today, they are a group of individuals that were mainly came to Slovenia at the time of Yugoslavia in the 80s, in the time of non-alignment movement. And so this is a kind of opportunity for us to establish our relations with them, to invite them to the museum, and to present their living in Slovenia. So this is our reality, and of course matters of belonging and citizenship are very much connected with our work. So, in short.
Okay, I've only recently become Dutch. Yippee! And in that moment, I also had to do a ceremony, and it was a wonderful ceremony, because the ceremony actually didn't celebrate Dutchness so much as it celebrated being an Amsterdammer. They said, "You're an Amsterdammer" about 70 times, and then right after that they say, "And you're Dutch." That's about cities, they love themselves. But one of the things that I've been thinking, and it goes back to almost everything that you've just said, is how to deal with conceptual frames that are always in flux. The idea of citizenship that is always in the move, that it is always, no matter how much you try to catch it up, it is moving again. Because one of the things that I've always thought when I came here, and a part of the integration, inburgening exams that you have to do in the Netherlands, you have to learn a lot of things as well, what you say, what it means to be good, a good Dutch person. Punctuality is one of those as well. But one of the things that I think in a reductive way as being archetypically Dutch is what I call the tyranny of the agenda. What is the agenda? Your diary. Lovely tyranny of the diary. And you learn it. You have to learn how to use your diary. And I'm really happy that I have a mobile phone now. Then my diary is here. But one of the things that I've always found fascinating is that tyranny, what I call of the diary, has very often no physical person. Meaning that it is not a white person or a black person or a blue person. It is that young post-migrant Moroccan Dutch person who uses the diary. And so the question that I have then in that regard is, for these global things within which we speak about you, Sandra, as you fit in more, as you become the Stuttgarter, what might that mean when we start to think with flexible categories? when migration is fact rather than fixed, and there's fixity and then there's migration as two separate categories. When citizenship is always moving. When Winti, the Afro-Caribbean tradition that we know comes from Suriname, is no longer just a Suriname religion, but as actually a part of the religious geography of what it means to be in the Netherlands. And it must be constituted as that. As one author, Abdul Qadir Benali, says, after how many 100 years do we think that Islam can be a religion of Europe? That is, I put it out there and open for questions for you. Any questions for Claudia, Nadja, or Pajoli?
Thank you. That was really interesting. I have to respond to the comment that was made about museums. I think it was, sorry, I don't know your name in the middle. Naina. You made a comment about, and it might have been me you were referring to, about how somebody had been talking earlier in the conference about museums being spaces where we can escape the real world, and that museums shouldn't be reduced to that. They should be about spaces for belonging and articulations of diversity and so on. I don't think that if we think about museums as places where we can escape the real world, and if it was me you were referring to, that's not what I said. I think I was talking about everyday life rather than the real world. But I think, however we characterize it, the point is thinking about what is the nature of the museum space. And the nature of the museum space is that it's very different from people's everyday lives, the ubiquity of their quotidian existence. And when they go into that museum space, whatever kind of experience they have, whatever kind of exhibition or museum event or activity or program that they're engaging with, there is a very different kind of opportunity that can be a very creative one to engage, yes, with questions of belonging, but also perhaps to reflect on themselves, perhaps to experience feelings of empathy, but also perhaps to be troubled and to be discomforted in different ways. So to articulate those spaces as something that's different from everyday life outside the museum, so it's an oppositional description. It doesn't mean that museums are not themselves living spaces, but what the point of that kind of oppositional description is to emphasize the fact that there is something very special about the museum space which can enable people to have experiences that are, by definition, different from the kinds of experiences that they may be having in their everyday life, and therefore may bring them out of, sometimes in very uncomfortable ways, their assumptions and attitudes and ways of thinking that they may have in their everyday life. So actually, I don't think it's a reductive way to think about museums at all. I think it's a very productive way to think about museums. Thanks.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Maybe that was the my nervousness up here and my not being used to this kind of... No. Yeah, of course, but I obviously didn't make myself clear because I did mean everyday life as opposed to the real world. I just thought that it's important that it's not the only option. And I do realize that if you visit a museum, however, for whatever period, and whichever museum for that matter, it is a very different experience than what you do when you go to the movies or go. This is also a point that Nicholas Thomas made, right? But I think it's maybe it's kind of a maybe I want to caution that it shouldn't be the emphasis of what we're looking at.
I would just add that I think that museums have really great opportunity, because museums are at the same time memory keepers, and on the other side really the big knowledge providers. And I think in this present situation we really have the opportunity to become, or to stay, or to become open arenas for discussions from encounters. And I think people more and more appreciate this. And also European politics as well. When Europeness was discussed yesterday and also today a little, let me remind you that next year the Museum of European History is going to be opened in Brussels, in Eastman's Palace. And this will be a great opportunity for all of us to discuss Europeness. And another thing, in 2018, there's going to be a European Year of Cultural Heritage, proclaimed by Council of Europe and Parliament, European Parliament. So we can see that there exists a great also political interest in Europeness, and I think our museums can play a great role in these questions.
Can I also add to something? Mm-hmm. Yeah, in references to, I think, what you were saying, and the reference to the wonder, you know, and this special sensations and feelings that the museums could bring us. It reminded me of Bettelheim's reminding us, you know, there is a deeper part of us that needs wonder and silence from rationality. So I'll you know, pick up on two words that have been sort of out of fashion for some time, and one of them is museum as temple, and the other one is roots. Yeah. As you were saying, you were referring, and we keep referring to this citizenship emotion, this difficulty to belong. But you know, I'm the daughter of a military. I've always moved, so I've experienced uprootedness all the time. And I'm not so sure that's a very comfortable place to be in. You know, we know of culture shock, for example. It exists. It has some problems. And, you know, I don't know if you saw La Grande Bellezza by Sorrentino. At one point, it struck me because I've always been subjected to culture shock. This nun, at one point, she asked the protagonist, do you know why I only eat roots? And she said, because we need them. This is just, you know, it's a movie. But in my experience of talking with people with a complex background like mine, in particular with a person that comes from Mozambique, that's where I did my field work, we talk about these problems together, you know, but it's questions, it's a looking for something that doesn't resolve itself, and they ask themselves questions, and most of them are unanswered, like this one. What he said to another colleague, he said, what are we teaching our children that is African? And you know, we so often remain silent, and having lived in Mozambique and knowing Mozambican culture and worldviews, it's so attached to giving something to the specific land piece, because you are with the ancestors. So, I mean, it's very, very tough things to deal, and then, you know, roots. So, and then, you know, I started thinking about, also with your help, of the museum as sort of a refuge, a temple. Another strange thing that happened to me in Stuttgart is that I go to church. I'm not Catholic anymore. I mean, I was, but churches are a place you sit, people smile, they don't ask you where you come from, and I feel okay for an hour. So, and I think, you know, this function of the museum as a temple reminded me of that, a place where you can just wander and sit and nobody. I think these museums do play this role in our cities. You know, we can sit in like here, like the Buddha room. I liked it a lot. So I was wondering, but then, you know, you have the feeling that more than a temple, we're building a fortress sometimes to protect ourselves from what's going on outside. So, you know, I don't know, it's thoughts, but maybe a haven, a safe haven for this kind of situations that I don't think have a very easy answer. But I do think that we I don't know, it's very hard to live on a citizenship that it doesn't have a citizenship, land of some sort, you know.
Michael, yeah, yes, finally. Go ahead.
I tried not to talk today, but, you know.
We know you couldn't, Michael, we know you
Yeah,
couldn't.
I know. So there are several things. Sorry. So Marseille is a city where people doesn't go because there's no work. So basically, people from Marseille end in Marseille, and they should not stay that long. So that was just about the comparison with Stuttgart. When we opened a museum 3 years ago, one of the issues that we had, it's a poor city, and with an urban model of the poverty is in the city center, which is very North American model. So the issue that we had, we had some survey about what is museum for you, audiences. And museum was a very scary thing. So in cultural practice, the scariest thing is opera, number one. And number two is museums, because it's either contemporary art, which, you know, content that's, you know, gonna shock you, either it's old dusty stones, quote. So, you know, we had to find, you know, a strategy toward our audiences. And we position ourselves saying that we cannot be a temple of culture, because the idea of temple involve, you know, the question of truth, and etc. So for those who have visited museum, we have built it up as an open space. You can come into the museum, lay down, having a sunbath, looking at the sea view, without having access to our exhibition. So we've been, you know, we had lots of issues about that, but then we thought that it is already a cultural practice to come into a national monument, because, you know, the museum is two buildings. One is a national monument with some content. And we are very much against, I guess, the idea of temple. And, you know, the only thing that we could do is having a critical space that you're gonna, you know, that you're gonna have access to, but not, I guess if you enter to the museum, it's more to have, yeah, a broader perspective on critical shared ideas. That's it.
And for Ines.
Yesterday we spoke a lot about Europe and contrasting it to the colonized countries, and so I have a question to Sandra. The first thing is that we are very lucky that you are, as a migrant, part of our museum. And you show us what is a good German, yeah? Okay. But my question is concerning Europe. Do the African people, the African board that we have, do they see you as European, as the colonizer, or is it easier for you to get along like a door opener because of your migrant background in the bad German cold landscape?
Should I answer?
Yes, please. Careful what you say, though. But
I know. It's many different things happen because, my identity is not clear, both as a person, you know, my personality also as I am not the, you know, stuffy white man with a beard, so. Nah. But I'm not black because, I mean, the color of your skin makes a big difference, you know, and that's a problem we should talk, a thing that exists, and we should talk about. And, you know, I think that maybe, you know, having people of different colors in our museums helps a lot. Like having a person like me in the strange place changes situations. You know, it's also, you know, visually, you get people used to things. But with me, well, there's different characters in the board. And it's similar often to what happens in fieldwork, like if there's someone older than you, they're paternal with me. So I have many people, you know, but do you have a boyfriend? No. Oh, it's because you have a PhD, stuff like that, you know.
That's true.
Yeah. So at least I have an answer. And then there is a younger woman that gets like the tough character that reminds me that I have authority and I have to have a responsibility. I'm a curator and I'm not just Sandra. So it goes back and forth, and everything is very useful. It's also, an experiment maybe of changing the curatorial approach, because, I cannot just be Sandra the migrant. I have to be also a curator, and it's we contract everything, and we try to together make something useful of these times. Well, we always have the sensation, we often have the sensations, and the older and wiser verbalize it. And keep repeating, we will not change the world, but at least in this table, things will have a safe haven of some sort. But yes, I think it's easier. My character, it makes it more creative. Our situation more creative, where we don't really know what's gonna happen. They don't know what to expect of me, and they understand that it's true that when I say, well, let's do it together, I mean it.
Absolute last question, yes?
Just about the question of temple. If I say, for me, museum is temple, everybody is against me, because we like to talk, we like to love, we like the life, and what's the temple? But the question is, for me, each society have a feeling of the holy things. And if the holy is not in museum, where it is?
Yeah. I will use that. If the holy is not in museums, then where is it? To perhaps reflect on that last statement, because I think that what we should recognize is that these conceptual frameworks come up to help us to think. The museum as temple, the museum as archive, the museum as spaces of memory, and the museum as a space where multicultural polities, post-colonial multicultural polities, move around, reverberate, contest, all of those things. The museums it's all of that. It is not one or the other. It does provide that space of pause where one can interact without talking to some people, where you can just look at things and see beauty. In a way, if you're at the Van Gogh Museum, you can't be in a pause because there are a million tourists with you and then you're trying to hide. So it is not that as well. But it does offer that pause, that rest in some instances. The question is, and I think this is where Nadja was also getting at in a way, the question is whether or not our museums have not somehow tried to hide from the very, very turgid political space, that political contestation, and not just a contestation over whether or not we are preserving heritage right or are we a heritage institution, but to realize that we are implicated in the very practices of governmentalizing some people and not others, or turning some people into the spectacular other or not. It is also that, and the question I think Nadja was trying to get at is whether or not that is also included as well in the work that we do. I am actually very hopeful, to be honest with you. As I said to you, that optimism for me is an empty category at this moment, but all moments. But from my own location, from the spaces that I do engage with in terms of study, I will say that a lot of my engagement have been with the colonized part of the Caribbean as a location to think with, a place that has been excluded from much ethnographic practices as having no space at all in the present, because it is always pre-Columbian. That is what is interesting for it. It is pre-Columbian. After that, when enslavement happened, ethnographic museums could not find interest in that space because it was not primitive enough to give any understanding of what it means to the hierarchy towards civilization. And in encountering with that space, I can say that if there is anything that I've ever come to feel from the Caribbean, and from the lives of black subjects in the diaspora, is actually to feel that without hope, one cannot structure futures. That actually, I used to sing. I'm going to do this for you. No, I won't. There is a lovely Negro Spiritual that I used to sing. It is called Negro Spiritual in the context of the US music genre. And it says, sooner will be done with the troubles of the world, going home to live with God, it says. And I'm not religious, but I tell people I'm an epistemological Rastafari, not a real one. But what is important from that sooner will be done is that under the absolute violence of the existence of the colonial project, people fashioned hope for a future. So whether Trump or no Trump, one has to do what Ruth suggested, that one has to fashion other futures through the structuring of different kinds of practices, different kinds of exhibitionary technologies, methods, which sometimes require us to be like Sandra a little bit, to be an outsider that is not an insider, that they can't understand because she's not German, but because she can play with the person who also feels like an outsider with them as they constitute something that is possible as futures. So I'm hopeful for our museum, even though I feel excluded myself sometimes from our museum. I feel excluded because sometimes the lives of people like me, I went into the V&A, I will give that story, and the lady who came to pick me up couldn't believe that I was the curator, so she walked beside me and she asked the construction worker whether or not he was Mr. Modest, the curator. So those things still happen. So if those things still happen, then there is not always reason for hope, for optimism. But the hope is a more of an urgency that we need to really rethink the practices that we've come to do in the present. Because yesterday, Monica's plea was a plea for what she says, Asami people that want to live in the present, mindful of a past that they still want to hold on to. And so in that regard, I would suggest that we leave this conference thanking everybody for your presentations, thanking all of you who flew from far away, thanking the people who I asked too late to come and they had to cancel a lot of things, thanking Lisa who stands at the back there who organized every single thing that made you come here, thank Sandra who demanded that we think differently about objects, Engine who demanded that we think about the kind of performative subjectivities that we can employ in the museum. Oh, by the way, for the SWICH partners, thanking Ninia, I hope all of you remember Ninia, who had a lovely baby boy on last Friday, and she's at home enjoying the baby boy. So I want you to thank you, but I also want to put again that urgency to think that we have work to do. Because if it is anything that I'm convinced of, the project of change, Europe has no end. Europe is always going to be changing. It is not something that we're going to move towards, and that is Europe, and all of us are going to look alike. In the same way, our work demands constant work, constant labor. Otherwise, we get complacent and we continue to represent people outside of the present. I thank you, enjoy, and you can criticize everything by email on the website. SWICH has a web presence, and this conference will also have a web presence. And what we hope to happen over the next year and a half, the remainder of SWICH anyway, 2 years, is that we keep the dialogue, and perhaps, I contradict Stephen, we will do this project so well that we might not have a need for another SWICH to think about the future of the Ethnographic Museum, but to do something else after 2 years. Start thinking about the past. But thank you for coming, and till next time.